On January 1st, 2026, China flipped a switch that most people didn't even notice. No dramatic announcement, no global summit, just a quiet regulatory update buried in a Ministry of Commerce directive that fundamentally rewired how silver flows around the planet. And if you're thinking this is just another bureaucratic shuffle that won't affect you, let me stop you right there. Because what Beijing just did to the silver market is the exact same playbook they perfected on rare earth elements over the past 15 years. And this time, Western nations have absolutely no response ready. The new licensing system doesn't look like a weapon. That's the entire point. It requires silver exporters to prove they produced at least 80 tons annually and maintained continuous export records from 2022 through 2024. Sounds reasonable, right? Industrial quality control. Except here's what that actually means. Hundreds of small and mid-sized exporters who supplied global industrial users for decades just got locked out of the market overnight. Not through quotas, not through outright bans. Through licensing requirements they literally cannot meet because they didn't exist in the exact configuration Beijing now demands. This isn't market regulation, it's a choke point disguised as paperwork. My name is Alex, and I've spent the last 8 years studying how nations weaponize resources without firing a single shot. And what China just executed with silver is the most sophisticated example of economic statecraft I've ever seen. If you want to understand how the next decade of global trade actually works, hit that subscribe button, because we're about to reverse engineer a strategy that took Beijing 15 years and billions of dollars to perfect. And the uncomfortable truth is this: they learned from every mistake, refined every tactic, and just deployed the final version on a metal that powers everything from solar panels to smartphones to missile guidance systems. And there's a reason they waited until now to do it. Here's what everyone misses about China's silver move. They're not trying to cut off supply completely. That would be obvious. That would trigger immediate international backlash and force diversification efforts. Beijing learned that lesson the hard way with rare earths back in 2010. No, what they've created is something far more elegant and far more dangerous: selective restriction. The ability to approve or delay or deny exports on a case-by-case basis without ever admitting political motivation. You play nice with Beijing, your export licenses sail through approval. You challenge China on trade policy or security issues, suddenly there are technical questions about your documentation, unexpected delays, new compliance requirements that didn't exist last month. And because it's all wrapped in legitimate-sounding regulatory language about environmental protection and resource conservation, there's no clear violation of World Trade Organization rules to point to. It's resource nationalism that learned to wear a business suit. But to understand why this matters so much, and why Western governments are quietly panicking right now, you need to see how Beijing developed this strategy. Because they didn't start with silver. They started with a group of 17 metallic elements most people had never heard of. Elements with names like neodymium and dysprosium and terbium. Rare earth elements. And over 15 years, China turned those obscure metals into the most sophisticated economic weapon in modern history. September 20th, 2010. That's when the world got its first real glimpse of what resource weaponization actually looks like. A Chinese fishing trawler collided with Japanese Coast Guard vessels near the Senkaku Islands, which China calls the Diaoyu Islands. Territorial dispute. Nothing new. Except Beijing's response was very new. Within days, Chinese customs officials suddenly discovered urgent need for enhanced inspection procedures on rare earth shipments to Japan. Trucks sat at borders, paperwork went missing, and according to multiple Japanese industrial sources, rare earth shipments to Japan effectively stopped. No official ban, no public announcement. Just a quiet halt that sent shockwaves through every Japanese electronics manufacturer who depended on those materials for everything from hard drives to hybrid car batteries. The message was crystal clear. Cross Beijing on territorial issues, and your supply chains suffer mysterious disruptions. But Beijing didn't stop there. A month later, they announced a 40% reduction in rare earth export quotas for the second half of 2010, not just to Japan, to everyone. Prices exploded. Neodymium oxide jumped from $45 per kilogram to over $200 in less than a year. And suddenly, Western governments woke up to a reality they'd ignored for 2 decades. China controlled 92% of global rare earth production, not because those elements only existed in China, because everyone else had let their mining and refining infrastructure collapse while China subsidized production and built absolute dominance. The United States, European Union, and Japan filed a formal complaint with the World Trade Organization in 2012. They argued China's export restrictions violated international trade rules, and here's where it gets interesting. Because Beijing fought that case for 2 years, and in 2014, they lost. The WTO ruled that China's rare earth quotas were illegal. So Beijing did something brilliant. They abolished the quotas in 2015, declared victory for free trade, and then immediately replaced the quota system with something far more effective: an export licensing framework that required state council permission. Suddenly, you didn't have a quota telling you how much you could export. You had a licensing system that could approve or deny any shipment for any number of legitimate sounding technical or environmental reasons. Same control, different mechanism. And this time, no obvious WTO violation to point to. What I'm about to show you next is where Beijing's strategy gets truly sophisticated, because they learned something critical from that 2010 rare earth shock. They learned they had overplayed their hand. By 2024, China's share of global rare earth production had dropped from 92% to 69%. That's a 23 percentage point decline. Why? Because the dramatic price spikes and supply disruptions of 2010 through 2012 finally triggered exactly what Beijing didn't want: massive investment in alternative supply chains. Australia's Lynas Corporation ramped up production at Mount Weld. The United States restarted operations at Mountain Pass in California. Japan secured supply agreements with Kazakhstan and Vietnam. That 40% quota cut and the Japan shipping halt scared Western governments and corporations enough that they spent billions developing alternatives. And Beijing watched their monopoly gradually weaken, so they adjusted the playbook. Instead of crude disruptions that trigger panic-driven diversification, they shifted to systematic control that maintains dependence. In 2021, Beijing forced consolidation of its rare earth industry under a single state-owned entity, China Rare Earth Group. Unprecedented centralization. Then they started testing the refined version of the strategy on other critical minerals. 2023, export controls on gallium and germanium, essential for semiconductors and fiber optics. 2024, graphite restrictions, crucial for electric vehicle batteries. Each move carefully calibrated. Each one framed in terms of national security and environmental protection. Each one testing how far they could push selective restriction without triggering the diversification response that weakened their rare earth dominance. And every single test worked. Because here's the thing about building alternative supply chains for critical minerals: it takes an enormous amount of time and capital. A new mine, from discovery to production, averages 6.5 years. A new refinery takes 3 to 5 years to build and optimize. So even when Western governments and companies recognize the threat, even when they commit funding, there's a massive gap between decision and delivery. And Beijing has learned to operate inside that gap. Apply pressure that's significant enough to create leverage, but gradual enough that it doesn't trigger the all-out crash program response that might actually work. Now let's talk about why silver is fundamentally different from rare earths, and why this matters so much more than most analysts realize. China doesn't just dominate silver production, they dominate silver refining. There's a critical distinction there. With rare earths, China controlled the mining. But countries like Australia and the United States had the geological deposits and could, with enough investment and time, rebuild refining capacity. They did. That's why China's rare earth share dropped 23 points. But silver refining is different. China controls somewhere between 60 and 70% of global refined silver supply. And when I say refined, I mean the pure, high-grade silver that actually goes into industrial applications. The kind that meets the purity specifications for solar panels and electrical contacts and medical equipment. Mexico is the world's second largest silver producer by mining output. But here's the problem: Mexico doesn't have the refining infrastructure. Much of Mexican silver ore gets shipped to China for refining. Same with ore from Peru and Bolivia and other major producing countries. The refining capacity, the technical expertise, the established supply chains, they're concentrated in China. And you can't just build a refining operation overnight. It requires specialized equipment, technical knowledge, environmental permitting, and years of operational optimization. The Western alternative to Chinese silver refining doesn't exist, and it can't be built fast enough to matter. Defense One published an analysis in July 2025 that called this exact dynamic resource governance weaponized not through crude disruptions, but through systemic control. And that phrase matters, because what Beijing has created isn't a light switch they flip on and off. It's a sophisticated valve system where they can adjust pressure on specific countries or specific industries based on their broader strategic interests. The licensing system that took effect January 1st gives them that control without the blowback that comes from obvious economic coercion. We're halfway through this, and if you're still watching, you're already ahead of 90% of people who still think global trade runs on free market principles. But stay with me, because what comes next explains why Elon Musk posted a warning about this on X and why the implications go way beyond silver prices. The legal infrastructure Beijing just put in place isn't temporary. That's what makes this so significant. The revised foreign trade law that took effect March 1st, 2026, provides permanent legal foundation for resource export controls. This isn't reactive policy. They can walk back when international pressure builds. It's institutionalized resource nationalism written into the legal code. The Ministry of Commerce frames it as critical mineral sovereignty, protection of resources and environment for domestic AI development and green energy sectors. Perfectly reasonable justification that happens to give them permanent authority to control who gets Chinese silver and who doesn't. Look at the timing. January 1st, new silver licensing requirements. March 1st, legal framework that makes those controls permanent. This was coordinated. This was planned. And the fact that it happened at the start of 2026, after years of testing the playbook on gallium and germanium and graphite, tells you Beijing is confident this version works. They've learned how to weaponize resources without triggering the WTO violations or the diversification panic that weakened their rare earth control. Here's the strategic logic, and once you see it, you can't unsee it. Game theory analysis of China's resource strategy shows they learned a critical lesson from 2010. Outright bans create immediate crisis, which creates political will for alternatives, which creates long-term competition. But licensing creates dependency without crisis. Countries aligned with China economically and diplomatically enjoy steady access. Their manufacturers get reliable supply. Their industries keep humming. But countries that challenge China on trade disputes or security issues or human rights, they face what researchers call technical delays, withheld approvals, sudden paperwork snarls. Nothing you can prove is political retaliation. Everything plausibly deniable as routine regulatory process. But the effect is the same. Your industries struggle with supply uncertainty while your competitor nations that stayed friendly with Beijing operate smoothly. Silver now joins rare earths, gallium, germanium, and graphite as tools of economic statecraft. Except silver's industrial importance is arguably greater than any of them. According to the Silver Institute, roughly half of global silver demand comes from industrial applications. Solar panels alone consumed over 100 million ounces in 2024. Every electric vehicle uses between 25 and 50 grams of silver in power electronics and battery contacts. Smartphones, laptops, medical devices, LED lighting, water purification systems, they all depend on silver's unique combination of electrical conductivity, thermal conductivity, and reflectivity. You cannot build modern technology without silver. And China just took control of who gets it. Elon Musk saw this immediately. On January 3rd, he posted on X, "This is not good. Silver is needed for many industrial processes." Tesla, like every electric vehicle manufacturer, faces acute exposure. Silver's role in EV power modules and battery systems is irreplaceable with current technology. You can't substitute copper or aluminum and maintain the performance specifications. And if Chinese silver exports face selective delays, Tesla's supply chain faces selective vulnerability. Same for every solar panel manufacturer. Same for every consumer electronics company. The industries driving the green energy transition and the technology economy are now navigating a market where the dominant supplier has explicit political control over export flows. The Asia Society hosted a webinar in December 2025 titled "Behind Beijing's Rare Earth Chokehold," and one point kept coming up. China doesn't need to cut off supply to achieve strategic advantage. They just need to create uncertainty. Because uncertainty forces companies to hold larger inventories, to build buffer stock, to pay premium prices for supply security, All of that increases costs, reduces competitiveness, and subtly shifts economic advantage toward Chinese domestic industries that don't face those supply chain risks. Now let's get into the uncomfortable psychology of why Western governments let this happen. Because it's not like the warning signs were hidden. The real reason this matters isn't just about silver supply, it's about the deeper shift happening in how global resources work. For decades, Western economic policy operated on an assumption. The assumption that economic interdependence creates stability. That if countries depend on each other for trade, they won't risk disruption because it hurts them too. Mutual dependence as mutual deterrent. And for a long time, that logic held. But Beijing looked at that same interdependence and saw it differently. They saw asymmetric leverage. If you depend on me more than I depend on you, I can extract concessions without firing a shot. And they've spent 20 years systematically building that asymmetry across critical resource supply chains. Rare earths were the prototype. Gallium and germanium were the refinement. And silver is the deployment at scale. The East Asia Forum published research on resource nationalism that described this as the carrot and stick strategy. Countries that align with Chinese foreign policy interests get the carrot. Reliable supply, favorable pricing, long-term contracts. Countries that don't get the stick, not bans, not sanctions, just friction, just uncertainty. Just enough disruption that their industries face competitive disadvantage compared to countries that played nice. And it's incredibly effective because it never crosses the line into overt economic warfare that might trigger coordinated international response. Here's the thing that keeps Western security analysts awake at night. Alternative supply chains for silver refining would take at least 5 years to build, probably longer. You need to secure mining rights, build or expand refining facilities, train workforce, establish quality control, get environmental permits, and integrate into existing industrial supply chains. 5 years minimum. And that's if governments and companies committed massive resources starting today, which they haven't. Because for most of the past decade, silver supply seemed fine, prices were stable, no crisis to drive action. That's the trap. By the time the leverage becomes obvious, it's too late to build alternatives fast enough to matter. Beijing controls refined silver supply now. They'll control it 5 years from now. And any Western effort to reduce dependence will happen slowly, expensively, and under conditions where Chinese state-owned enterprises can undercut pricing to make those alternative operations economically unviable. It's the same playbook that kept rare earth alternatives struggling for years even after Mountain Pass restarted. Compare this to rare earths for a second, because the comparison reveals why silver is actually more dangerous. When China's rare earth dominance became obvious in 2010, there were at least dormant mining operations in other countries that could restart. Mountain Pass in California had operated before. Lynas in Australia had known deposits. The infrastructure had existed. It just needed capital and time to restart. But silver refining concentration in China developed more recently and more completely. There aren't dormant refineries in Arizona or Nevada waiting to restart. The infrastructure never existed at scale in the first place, which means building alternatives isn't restarting. It's starting from scratch. Way harder, way more expensive, way more time-consuming. Almost there now, and I want to tie this all together because understanding how these pieces connect changes how you see the next decade of global economics. Beijing's silver strategy represents the culmination of 15 years of learning. They learned from the 2010 rare earth overreach that dramatic disruption triggers diversification. So they developed licensing systems that provide control without crisis. They learned from the WTO case that explicit quotas can be challenged. So they shifted to regulatory frameworks that achieve the same effect through legitimate-sounding administrative process. They learned from watching their rare earth market share decline that dominance requires maintaining dependence without triggering panic. So they calibrated their approach to create leverage while keeping alternatives economically unviable. What's happening with silver isn't an isolated trade policy. It's the refined final version of a strategy that's been tested and optimized across multiple critical minerals over 15 years. And it's being deployed at a moment when Western industrial policy is massively increasing silver demand through green energy transitions and electronics manufacturing, while doing nothing to secure alternative refining capacity. The January 1st licensing requirements are already having effects that most people haven't noticed yet. Small and mid-sized Chinese exporters who supplied international buyers for years are being consolidated or shut out. Export approvals are taking longer. And according to commodities traders I've spoken with, there's a subtle divergence happening in pricing. Silver going to certain countries moves smoothly. Silver going to others faces mysterious delays that create spot shortages and premium pricing. Nothing dramatic, nothing that makes headlines. Just the quiet reconfiguration of who gets reliable access and who doesn't. And here's what makes this truly sophisticated. China can always claim they're just enforcing quality standards, protecting their environment, managing domestic resource needs for their own industrial development. Every justification sounds reasonable in isolation. The fact that the aggregate effect creates strategic leverage over critical industries in countries that challenge Chinese policy? That's just a coincidence. Except it's not a coincidence, it's the entire point. The Diplomat covered China's rare earth strategy under the headline, carrot and stick, and that framework applies perfectly to silver. Countries that accept China's position on Taiwan, that stay quiet on human rights issues in Xinjiang, that don't join security alliances, Beijing views as threatening, they get the carrot. Their silver supply flows smoothly. Their industries stay competitive. But countries that push back, they get the stick. Not overtly, not obviously. Just enough friction to create disadvantage. Just enough uncertainty to force costly hedging strategies. Just enough leverage to shape behavior without ever making explicit threats. The era of freely flowing Chinese silver ended January 1st, 2026. And unlike rare earths, where 15 years of diversification efforts reduced China's mining share by 23 percentage points, silver has no alternative supply chain waiting to activate. The refining infrastructure doesn't exist. The technical expertise isn't distributed, and the timeline to build alternatives stretches years into the future, while Beijing's control operates right now. Remember that boulder I mentioned at the start? The feeling of trying to push something massive uphill while the system works against you? Here's where we are. Western governments and corporations spent decades outsourcing critical refining capacity to China because it was cheaper, because environmental regulations were laxer, because it seemed like smart business. And now they're standing at the bottom of a hill they didn't realize they were on, looking up at a system they can't change fast enough to matter. Beijing spent 15 years pushing that boulder uphill, learning the physics, testing the route. And now they're at the top, and gravity works for them. You're not pushing anymore. You're the one watching the boulder roll. And the question isn't whether it's rolling. The question is what happens to the industries and economies in its path. Because when you control silver refining, you control the material input for solar panels that Western countries need for climate goals, for electric vehicles they need for transportation transitions, for smartphones and data centers and defense electronics they need for economic competitiveness and national security. That's not trade policy. That's strategic leverage. And it doesn't require blockades or sanctions or military threats. It just requires control over something everyone needs and nobody else can supply. Welcome to the new economics of interdependence, where the country that controls the choke points writes the rules. Your move, if you even have one.